Come on, fish. Give me an eat right here. We're gonna do a short session today on dry dropper. Just a little bit of thoughts that I have on fishing the dry fly and a nymph on a Euro nymph setup. We're gonna fish just a little stretch of water here, hopefully catch a fish or two, and I'm gonna show you how I set it up. So I have my sighter, I have either a tippet ring or I have a little perfection loop at the bottom. I'm gonna add a piece of tippet to that, 5X, and then I'm gonna do a tag system. Off that tag, from the 5X, I'm gonna put my dry fly, and then I'm gonna continue down with 6X to my nymph. Hopefully, if a fish eats and breaks off, or I get into a snag or whatever, I lose that nymph. Well, hopefully I don't lose anything, but if I lose something, it's the nymph and not the dry fly, because the dry fly, preferably on the 5X, won't break there. So that's how I'm gonna set this up. When measuring and adding any sort of tippet, I like to use measurements, because then I can replicate those measurements. If you break off, or the more variables you control, the more outcomes in a sense you have, and the more things, the variables that you can't control, you can work on more. Okay, so I have a piece of 5X, and then I'm gonna add a little piece of 6X, and that's when I'm gonna put my nymph on the 6, and then my dry fly will be attached to the 5. So anytime I add any piece of tippet, use just a little bit of saliva, but preferably just water, just to, when you pull those knots together, to keep it from heating up. So like I said, once again, preferably my dry fly is going to go on the thicker piece of the two tag ends. A lot of people ask, why do you do it off the tag ends? There's a good multitude of reasons why, and I won't get into them at too depth, but it gives the fly a little bit more natural movement. There's another thing we call the spin. When the fly is on a tag system, it has the ability to kind of float naturally, and when something comes in connection with it, that fly will turn too. Sometimes detecting bites before you get what we call the slam dunk, when it just like crushes under there. That's really important when you're fishing slower water. Something Gordon Vanderpool showed me. So when it comes to knowing how deep I want to have my dropper under my dry fly, I try to do kind of averages. If I know where the fish are holding in water depth, I'll kind of try to be just maybe a little less. Let's just say on average it's 2 foot deep. Maybe I'll just be just a little under that for my nymph. The cool thing about fishing that on a Euro setup, the dry dropper, is if you get into skinny water, which I'll show you, you can lift the dry fly off the water and just fish it like a tight line. You don't always have to have the dry fly on the surface to make a drift, because you're going to get in situations where you might have very short pockets and there's not enough length for a dry fly and a nymph to kind of sit, set up, and drift through, which you might need to hold that dry fly off the surface to make a short drift. So there's a lot of benefits to fishing dry dropper on the Euro setup. I think that it's just a very sensitive tool, and you can fish at fair distances. Don't think when you hear dry dropper, it has to be fish rising. Even in the coldest, deadest of winter, especially when the water's low, you can fish a little bit further distances. And what the dry dropper does, it kind of just like sets the depth of that nymph, the depth. And you can fish really slow and get that nymph to hopefully just hold in front of that fish for a long time, encouraging a strike. So some of the flies you can purchase through Fully Miller or patterns that I tie are the +1, has a light and a dark variation. It's great for mayflies. I'm just searching. It's more of a all-around pattern. The dark for maybe darker nymphs, and the lights for just lighter nymphs. There's also a Sulphur nymph, the one we call the Zone Stone, and I have a new one, the Clueless Caddis. It's really great for especially like Euro dry dropper. I love fishing Euro dry dropper. Having a fly that is tied with enough material to suspend some pretty heavy nymphs can be really key at times. So that's a great fly to the arsenal. I hope you enjoy. So when it comes to pre-treating these, this Clueless Caddis has a lot of synthetic materials in it, and I don't mind just using a little high and dry, dipping it in there, and kind of removing the excess. And then once it starts sinking, you don't want to use this again because that'll seal in the moisture. You want to use like a desiccant with a brush, and I'll show you that if that happens. But these flies float so well. You could fish 3 millimeter, 3.5. I mean, maybe even a 4 millimeter in a short amount of time. So when you're casting a dry dropper, if you have downstream breeze with a light leader, especially, when you overhead cast, there's a lot of chance breeze that is, the higher you get in the sky, a lot of times it's more velocity up there, that wind is going to, two things, reduce your distance and deplete your accuracy. That's where that frisbee low angle cast, I can blast through the wind a lot easier with a lot less movement because you're keeping the fly and leader very low in the water in a straight line, and you can push that fly through. So I kind of have like an obstacle of this branch here. I can kind of try to keep it underneath or try to go overhead, but you need to, like I said, be aware of all your casting angles with the trees and everything. You try. Beautiful fish. The cool thing too is when I cast low, right at the end I can kind of rise and lift that leader and be really connected to that fly. I don't want to be maybe right on it, like really tight where it's almost moving it. You want to have like a little bit of slack between you and the fly, because it'll help it to move a little more naturally. So when I cast, I can just lift right at the end, kind of lift that leader up and make really good connection. Usually I can say this stuff and immediately catch a fish. Like, this is comical, Dom. This is a good learning moment right here. So when I set the hook with a dry dropper, if possible, because, sometimes it's not, I want to set kind of at an angle out or wherever my rod is following my fly. I noticed, especially guiding, even this week, fishing dry dropper, anglers would pull their rod kind of like dip, which creates slack, which creates a break off, and goes sideways real low. When the fly is under when the fish ate it, the dry fly has a lot of resistance. So the hook set was really slow pulling that dry, where if you can if possible, set up, I think you have the fly moves faster out of the water and pierce that fish a little faster. But in this situation, I'm under the bridge, I can't. Sometimes those rules or whatever we come up with, it needs to be broken. You need to be able to be dynamic to fish different areas. So in this situation, like George Daniel, him and I fished this river, and he talked about strip set. Like even when you're nymphing, when you're connected with your setup, if you strip set and maybe set a little bit or a variation or combination of whatever, all you need to do is move that point of the hook to pierce that fish. But you got to do it somehow. Of course, we don't want to hit our rods off bridges like this. So in this situation, I got to have a low hook set. Beautiful area up here. Kind of like, it's early spring, the water's cold. I still kind of feel the fish are in like that slower water mode. And when I approach this, I almost look at it as like, this is my barrier. This rock area is gonna, if I stay on this side, I'm not in their home, but if the second I step over there, they're gonna feel me for a long distance. So I'm gonna use this as kind of a sound barrier and stay downstream and try to fish up into that pool. One thing I notice, a lot of times you get a lot of tip wrap, or when the line gets wrapped around your tip or anywhere on your rod. A lot of times I don't know if anglers really know how to, I see kind of people like, sometimes you got to get to the tip of it. If you do, if there's nowhere to put your rod down, you can break your rod apart and get to it that way. Or what I try to do before I do any of that is use the water downstream and pull my leader and shake my rod. Sometimes it'll get out that way. So before I make a long cast in there, I'm gonna kind of grit it apart and hopefully be able to pick a fish or two out if possible before I do one big cast in the middle and spook those other potential fish. Maybe way up in that last little riff, way up there, maybe a bite. Nah, almost. Hard cast. There we go. So even in skinny, shallow water, that dry dropper can be pretty effective. We'll get one of these guys to eat. There we go. Nice little fish here. Is this good? This is when I play drums. And you can add that too if you want.